like to introduce Professor Charles Cockell, who's Professor of Astrobiology at the University of Edinburgh and Director of the UK Centre for Astrobiology. Charles is going to talk to us about uninhabited habitats in the universe.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. So Dave has reminded me to say that Astrobiology Society of Britain conference is in September, and the information is on the back of the brochure. So if you're interested in astrobiology, do come along to that. I think it's 3 days at UCL, but the information is there anyway. I want to talk about something that's actually a bit of a counterpoint, I think, to the previous two talks. So I think it's useful in the context of this conference, which is this concept that I refer to here as uninhabited habitats, that I'll define right from the beginning as a habitat or an environment that contains all of the requirements for a known form of life, but actually contains no such life. And you'll understand that when we talk about habitats or habitability, we are, by definition, talking about an environment with respect to a known form of life. That's just a necessary limitation of biology and in the wider context, astrobiology as well. So the possibility of environments that have everything that's needed for life, but in fact contain no such life. And there's an underlying paradigm in astrobiology and in fact ecology on the Earth as well, and I'll come back to this in a second as to why it is. The presence of habitable conditions implies the presence of life, and you'll see this right the way throughout the astrobiology literature. We're looking for habitable environments in the universe, and there's a sort of assumption that when we find that, we're going to find life there, and therefore astrobiology is all about searching for habitable environments. And the mission implications are that once we find habitable conditions, then the presence or absence of life provides a definitive answer to whether other planetary bodies are inhabited. And I want to address this, which I think is an incorrect assumption in astrobiology. So on the Earth, we tend to find that where there are habitable conditions, there is life. And it's easy to understand why this paradigm exists. And you can find it throughout the ecological literature. And it's because we live on a planet with a hugely productive photosynthetic biosphere. So carbon that's produced as a waste product from photosynthesis is used in aerobic and anaerobic respiration by microorganisms and other organisms. And then oxygen, which is another waste product of oxygenic photosynthesis, is an electron acceptor for aerobic respiration, and in fact a variety of chemosynthetic pathways as well, things like ion oxidation using oxygen. And habitats are interconnected by the water, the hydrological cycle on the Earth, and also by the atmosphere, which is rather clement. I mean, we know that the atmosphere contains large numbers of microorganisms that are being transported across the planet. So the result of these clement atmospheric conditions, the hydrological cycle and the hugely productive photosynthetic biosphere, is that even the most ephemeral habitat, such as a meltwater pond in Antarctica, very rapidly becomes colonized by life. So it's very rare to find a habitat that is at the same time sterile. You can find them transiently. So here's an example of a natural uninhabited habitat. This is some work we were doing in this unpronounceable place, Eyjafjallajökull, in the south of Iceland, where the lava flow erupted, I think now 4 years ago, I forget now, that shut down European air travel. This is the lava flow, and we got some NERC funding to look at the earliest colonists of this lava 2 to 3 months after the eruption, to try and understand what are the earliest colonists of lava flows. And so we studied the surface of these lava flows, and this is a paper that describes the colonists, lots of chemolithotrophs living on the surface using iron and sulfur in the first 2 to 4 months after the eruption. That's the bit I'm not interested in with respect to this talk. What I'm interested in is that we drilled down several centimeters into this lava flow to look at the microbes inside the lava that were the earliest colonists, because we thought, well, maybe the stuff on the surface is just things that are washed in from the atmosphere and they're not really doing anything, but perhaps inside the lava we'll find microbes that have become established early on and are doing biogeochemistry. And what we found is that after 2 or 3 months at 5 centimeters depth, there was no detectable life in this lava flow by DNA extraction, microscopy and culturing, no evidence of life. And when we thought about that, we thought, well, maybe that's not so surprising. It's only 2 to 4 months after the eruption. Life has not yet had time to percolate into the lava and become established inside the lava flow. So what we seem to have inside this lava flow is a habitable environment, and we know it's habitable because the surface has active microorganisms, but where there's no life. So this could be an example of an uninhabited habitat, and this is what got me thinking about uninhabited habitats, that, as I said earlier, we might describe as an environment capable of supporting the growth of at least one known organism, but containing no such organism. And on the Earth today, we would expect to find these environments primarily as being highly transient and mainly in primary succession habitats like lava flows, where you've got a new habitable environment that's just been formed, but life has not yet had time to become established there. And that period of becoming established is, as I said in that earlier slide, likely to be extremely short. And these sorts of observations explain this paradigmatic link between habitable conditions and the presence of life in ecology that then pervades astrobiology. You can make an uninhabited habitat artificially. So this is the caldera of Eyjafjallajökull, and it's very hot just beneath the surface. If you stick a temperature probe just beneath the surface of this rock, it's about 240 degrees, about 3 or 4 centimeters depth. If you stand on this, you can actually start to smell your boots melting. You can't stand around there for very long. If I get a rock hammer and I take out a rock from just beneath the surface and I leave it on the surface, at the moment that rock drops below the upper temperature limit for life, which is 122 degrees at the current time in the literature, this rock becomes an uninhabited habitat. It's now habitable with respect to known life, but it contains no life. So this is an example of an uninhabited habitat. I'll come back to that later. So we might summarize, just in the meantime, by saying that we could split all known environments in the universe into 3 types. There's uninhabitable environments, which is things like the core of the Earth and the Sun. We can think up plenty of other trite examples of uninhabitable environments in the universe. There's inhabited habitats, which we can observe just by looking out of the window into the lawn of St Hugh's College. And then habitable but uninhabitable environments, or uninhabited habitats, that are rare on the Earth. But the question is, are they more common elsewhere in the universe? And might they constitute a significant percentage of the habitable space in the known universe? And we can conceive of uninhabited habitats, so purely from a theoretical point of view, in 2 sorts of environments. First of all, uninhabited habitats on an inhabited planet, which would result from a transient habitat or lack of transfer mechanisms for life, lack of interconnectivity into newly created sterilized habitats, or even lack of appropriately evolved biochemistries for a particular habitat. As I showed earlier, uninhabited habitats on an inhabited planet, this is the example we have here is planet Earth, where uninhabited habitats are extremely rare. We might also wonder about uninhabited habitats on an uninhabited planet. We still don't know how common the conditions are for the origin of life and how difficult it is to go from prebiotic chemistry to the formation of life. So we could imagine, for example, if the origin of life is rare or requires some unusual reaction, that we might have planets that have habitable conditions, but where an origin of life has not occurred, or where life has not been transferred from an inhabited planet elsewhere, if indeed that mechanism is viable. And therefore we could end up with a class of planets in the universe that are uninhabited but habitable worlds. And as I say, we don't know enough about the origin of life. We don't know how common these worlds are in the universe. But if they exist, then this would be a second class of world that is constituted of uninhabited habitats. Now you might think, am I off on some intellectual excursion that's interesting but not really relevant to anything? Uninhabited habitats, I think, do have some relevance. So I've just listed some reasons why we might be interested in looking at these environments despite the fact they've got no life in them. First of all, if they are another type of habitable environment, then simply understanding how common they are in the universe is an important part of classifying habitability in the universe. We shouldn't become too obsessed by this need to find life that tends to be embedded in astrobiology. The discovery of habitable but lifeless environments would be equally significant for astrobiology, because it would allow us to gather a more complete understanding of the distribution of habitability in the universe decoupled from life. And the other interesting thing about them is that they would provide control environments. So if you look at isotopic signatures of life on early Earth, scientists spend a lot of time trying to disentangle those from abiotic processes. It's very difficult to do because we don't have control environments that were habitable but contained no life on early Earth, to be able to truly understand whether those isotopic signatures, for example, are caused by life or abiotic processes. So if we go through the universe to say, for example, to Mars, and we could find environments that were habitable but never had life, we would finally have a proper control environment for understanding the role of biology in sort of isotopic or morphological changes related to life that would allow us to understand early Earth processes. And at the moment we don't have those controls. That's not poor science, it's just because we don't have those controls. But if we could find uninhabited habitats, we might finally have proper controls. They will give us environments to understand the origin of life. If we had a habitable environment with no life in, we could see what are the organic constituents of those sorts of environments and how might they tell us something about the origin of life. And then there are ethical questions I'm not going to dwell on any longer. What happens if you turn up at a planet and find it's habitable but uninhabited? Would it be unethical to introduce life into that environment? For a biologist, that would be an astonishingly interesting experiment, to do a primary succession colonization experiment in a habitat that's habitable but contains no life. But is that ethical? Does it compromise the potential for life in the future, and so on and so forth? I won't address that any further. We can do experiments to look at uninhabited habitats. So this is something I did a few months ago, just to try and get at this question in a bit more detail. I created an artificial uninhabited habitat. So this is a series of silica discs that you can buy. They're actually filters that you put in normal laboratory filters. You can buy these sintered glass discs. And I've stacked them up into an artificial endolith, and I've sealed them up and put wire around them. You can see one here, and you can see the stacked up discs here. And I've cooked them to 500 degrees to sterilize them and removed all the organics. But I've turned them into an uninhabited habitat by providing everything that's needed for life. So I've soaked them through with yeast extracts. They've got liquid water, so these are the requirements for habitability. They've got major elements, Chernop's elements here, provided in yeast extract, also trace elements. And they've got an energy. They've got an energy source in forms of organics in the yeast extract and oxygen in the atmosphere. It's a redox couple for aerobic respiration. And there's also organics in there from the yeast extract that could potentially be used for fermentation. There's also iron and sulfate in there as a trace element, so potentially iron and sulfate reduction using organics. So this is now an uninhabited habitat that has all the requirements for certain known forms of life, but there's no life in it. And I've put them out in my garden in Edinburgh. You can see here, these are the uninhabited habitats. These are just some lava pieces that I sterilised as well. These ones are exposed to the atmosphere and the hydrological cycle. The ones under the tile are exposed to the atmosphere but not to the hydrological cycle, so they're just protected from rain and snow. And the question is, how quickly are these colonised? This is some work that Luke did as part of his project in my lab. So this is just the mean values of colony-forming units. So I'm just looking at colony-forming units on yeast plates, because remember, the yeast is what's in there. So those are the organisms we're looking at in terms of habitability. And these are the mean values at all depths of the covered and the fully exposed uninhabited habitats. And what you can see very simply here, qualitatively, is after 1 day, you can see through different depths here. These are the mean, of 3 triplicate samples at different depths. So these are the 4 different depths. So I've actually made these uninhabited habitats with, so I've shown 5 here, but there are actually 4 in the ones that I made. These are some new ones we made recently. So there are 4 depths in here. And you can see that after 1 day, the surface is colonised in the exposed samples. In the covered samples, it remains an uninhabited habitat. After 1 week, we have greater colonisation, where we've got colonisation through all 4 depths of the uninhabited habitat, and then colonisation of the covered samples in the lower part of the discs. And then after 1 month, colonisation of the surface in both the covered and exposed, and through to the final depth here. If you break this up and look at the different triplicates in the experiment, so this is now looking at 1 day, 1 week and 1 month, covered and exposed, and you've got the numbers of colony forming units. What you'll see is that in the covered samples under 1 day, after 1 day, the discs are all remain uninhabited habitats. I'm not going to talk about the data in the middle here just for time. I just want to go through to 1 month and show you that after 1 month, the exposed samples at all depths in all in all samples are colonized. So we go from two end-member situations here where there's uninhabited habitats in the covered samples after 1 day and colonization of all depths and all triplicates in the exposed samples after 1 month. And what these data allow you to do is to start to quantify the loss of uninhabited habitats on the surface of the Earth. And I've just put some conclusions here. Uninhabited habitats retained in covered conditions for 1 day. Loss of uninhabited habitats is spatially inhomogeneous, both vertically and horizontally. That's perhaps not surprising, given what we'd expect about microbial distribution in the atmosphere. Loss of all uninhabited habitats at all depths in all experiment repeats 1 month in the exposed samples. And if you do the stats on this, you find that the hydrological cycle, at least in this experiment, contributes about 60% of the colonization of the uninhabited habitats. The other 40% caused just by microbes drifting around in the atmosphere in the wind. 60% caused by rain events on the surface of those rocks. So without going into this data in too much more detail, the qualitative point I want to make is that you can see why it is that uninhabited habitats are rare on the Earth, and why it is that they're not really discussed in the ecological literature. You can see how quickly they disappear. So the question from the astrobiology point of view is, are they more common elsewhere? And you can look at some images, for example, the surface of Mars. Let's go to Mars now. This has relevance to Europa and Enceladus, but I just want to use Mars because there are some particularly good examples. And you can find environments where there's been water-rock interactions in the past and are documented. For example, this is the wheel track of the Spirit rover, and these white deposits here are silica that are putative products of the interactions of water and volcanic rocks about 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago. And you could imagine, for example, that if this was habitable, but this was either Mars was uninhabited or these deposits were disconnected from the rest of the planet, what you would have here is a potentially habitable environment that was uninhabited. This is ice that was photographed at the Phoenix landing site in the north polar region of Mars, and you can see it subliming away after the scoop has removed the surface soil. And there's a nice paper by Carol Stoker suggesting at higher obliquity these ices would melt. And she's claiming in that paper that the melting of these ices would create a habitable environment on the surface of Mars, where you've got liquid water in contact with volcanic rocks and the other requirements for life. But again, if we imagine that this melted ice was disconnected from other environments on the surface of Mars, even if Mars was inhabited, we could imagine this melted ice would be an uninhabited habitat. And we might even consider a hypothetical scenario where we could have an impact, for example, into the permafrost of Mars that I've shown here that melts that surface ice. And even if we imagine that Mars was inhabited in its deep subsurface, the cryosphere would create a disconnect between this transient body of liquid water and the inhabited deep subsurface. The atmosphere is dry, it's desiccating, high levels of UV radiation. There's no surface hydrology to bring in organisms. We could imagine that a body of liquid water generated in a hydrothermal system in an impact crater could remain an uninhabited habitat for some considerable period of time, even on an inhabited Mars, if it remained disconnected from an inhabited region. And so this idea of a large body, a lake, even a pond that just sits there completely sterile is something that's very difficult for us to grasp with our ecological understanding of the Earth. But given the conditions on the surface of Mars and what we know about the history of liquid water on Mars, we might imagine that these conditions are more common. So we wrote a paper with some colleagues called Uninhabited Habitats on Mars a few years ago, where we predicted that uninhabited habitats might be more common on Mars, and we described how we could test this hypothesis. We would look for environments that were habitable, had all the conditions required for life, but do not contain any evidence of past life. And that might be strong evidence of an uninhabited habitat. A future robotic craft and samples returned from Mars might be able to directly show if uninhabited habitats existed or not. And then at the end of last year, the intriguing couple of papers in Science from the Curiosity team in the same issue. The first one talking about the claim of a discovery of a habitable environment on the surface of Mars. This is heady stuff. I mean, it says, preserve evidence of an environment that would have been suited to support a Martian biosphere founded on cumulithic autotrophy. Okay, so this is a fairly bold claim that was made in this paper. So what they're saying is we found an environment that was habitable. And we can argue about the content of this paper, but if we take the claim at face value, they're saying this is a habitable environment. But in the same issue, there's another paper about the organics that were found, and it says there may be organic matter in these samples, but it is not being confirmed as Martian. Okay? And since then, there have been new papers showing that there are organics at the Curiosity site, but still not organics associated with life. So how do you interpret this data at the current time? Well, there are two possible interpretations of the data as it exists at the moment. That what they have observed is an uninhabited habitat, so it's a habitable environment, but there's no evidence for life in that environment, or that what they found is a habitable environment that did also contain life, but the biosignatures have been destroyed since that site was laid down, either by ionizing radiation or reactive oxygen species or whatever else. And it's very difficult to distinguish between those two things at the current time. But one way in which you can attempt to distinguish between them in the absence of other data is just to apply Occam's razor, which cautions us to accept the explanation with the smallest number of assumptions. An uninhabited habitat merely assumes that there were habitable conditions. It says nothing about the presence of life on Mars. So that's the only assumption we make in saying that a place was an uninhabited habitat. And if the Grotzinger team are correct that that environment was habitable, then we could assume it's an uninhabited habitat. An inhabited habitat assumes that not only were there habitable conditions, but that life originated on Mars or was transferred to Mars and existed in that site, and the biosignatures have been destroyed since that time. So there's a series of assumptions to decide that what has been discovered in those previous claims is an inhabited habitat. So at the current time, we might conclude that what's been found by the Curiosity rover is an uninhabited habitat, a potential lake that was inhabited but contained no such life. And I think at the moment that remains a reasonable assumption based on the data. We still don't have data suggesting there was life in that environment, but that could change. So does the presence of habitable conditions imply the presence of life? Well, on Mars, the inclement atmosphere and lack of large-scale hydrological cycles suggest the potential for long-lived uninhabited habitats. And the presence of habitable conditions but the lack of life does not imply that Mars was lifeless. This is also important. If you go to Gale Crater and you find habitable conditions, we never find conditions for life. That doesn't tell you there was no life on Mars. It could just be that life is buried deep in the deep subsurface and just hasn't made it to the surface. And what you're looking at is a lake that was essentially disconnected from a habitable environment, but that remained lifeless. And it may imply that, in fact, we need much greater search efforts to look for life on Mars. And that's not necessarily a plea for more funding and rovers and astrobiology missions, but the clear conclusion is that finding habitable conditions but a lack of life doesn't really tell you much. You actually have to go and explore Mars in many environments and in the subsurface before you can truly conclude that it was habitable but there was no life anywhere on the planet. In other words, this planet was an uninhabited habitat on a planetary scale. And so it raises questions, of course, in the rest of the universe, quite beyond Mars. For, in the context of this discussion, Enceladus in Europa, possibly we might have habitable oceans there that contain no life. If the origin of life, for example, required a volcanic region with particular chemical conditions, you could imagine that Europa and Enceladus are habitable, but there were never conditions for the origin of life, in which case they may still be sitting there without life. And beyond our own solar system, a possible class of exoplanets called uninhabited habitable worlds, I've called them here. If you look, you don't even have to look at papers. You just go onto Google and put habitable worlds. You come up with these amazing statements like 8.8 billion habitable Earth-sized planets exist in the Milky Way alone. And this is no longer sort of fatuous science fiction. This is based on the Kepler Space Telescope data and simple extrapolations to the size of the galaxy. These numbers 100 years ago would have just been astonishing. I think people would not have believed these numbers could exist. The question is, if there are all these habitable worlds, are they all inhabited? Does this mean 8.8 billion inhabited Earth-sized planets elsewhere in the universe? And I would contend that if we build extrasolar planet telescopes and we look at habitable worlds in the universe and we find a suspicious lack of oxygen biosignatures, it might be telling us that there are a lot of uninhabited habitats. Of course, we can still have a planet that's got life that's not producing oxygen, so we could still have a planet that has life but no detectable biosignatures. We might begin to wonder whether, in fact, we're looking at a universe where there are, in fact, many habitable planets, but where an origin of life has not occurred. So this is an outstanding issue, I think, in terms of exoplanets, is how many of these habitable worlds do we really expect to be inhabited. So I think the summary of my talk here is very simple, and that's a word of caution about this optimism about looking for life elsewhere in the universe, and this idea that all we've got to do is go and find habitable worlds and we'll all be happy because we'll have a sample of life. And I think we have to be ready not to find life, but to be equally excited by finding an uninhabited habitat, because that tells us something about the distribution of life in the universe. Not so interesting for biologists like me, who would like to get a sample of alien life and look at it in the laboratory, but equally important for an astrobiological understanding of the universe. So that's all I have to say. Thanks a lot, William, for inviting me.
So before we colonize Mars, or even before we land on Mars with humans, we should prove that Mars is completely lifeless. What would you accept as a strategy to give a reasonable proof that there is no life on Mars? I think it's one drilling into an uninhabited habitat is not enough.
Yeah, it's, this question can go on for hours. It's good pub talk. It's very difficult to give. My simple response would be this: if we can show there's no life on the surface or the top few meters, I would be happy with humans on Mars. It's a bit like saying I should be worried about tipping my tea on the floor just in case I just destroy the deep subsurface biosphere under Oxford. I mean, even on the Earth, there's a disconnect between the surface and the deep biosphere on our planet. So I think that humans wandering around on the surface of Mars, even building a station, probably would have a low chance of compromising a deep biosphere on Mars if it existed, just because of the lack of connectivity, and an even greater lack of connectivity between the surface and subsurface on Mars compared to the Earth. So I would just be careful not to put humans near any place on the surface that might have life, or at least to assay the surface properly for the presence of life. And if I didn't really find environments where there was life, I think you could put a base there without too much worry. I mean, we put bases in Antarctica without destroying the whole of Antarctic microbiology. Although in truth, I think it hasn't really been examined that greatly as to what the human impact is. But I think the impact would be limited. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charles.
Yeah,